So, as luck and schedules would have it, we've all come together and are able to be here and kind of discuss this exciting topic. And so I thought a bit about this topic, visual anthrozoology, and the truth be told, I hadn't heard the word anthrozoology until fairly recently. And I saw it and I was like, wow, that seems interesting. That seems like something that I've been thinking about and looking more into it, seeing it as the study of human animal interactions. And so then I thought, well, what would visual anthrozoology be? And so the sort of working definition that I have been thinking about, which is certainly up for debate and modification, is kind of the study of how representations of animals are made and used by humans, whether they be artists or researchers or media outlets or the general public, and what effect these representations have on our understanding of and interactions with animals themselves. And so I was thinking about this idea of representation and what is a representation. And the way I've been thinking about it was kind of any animal likeness that was produced through the filter of a human brain. And, I'm thinking it could be a photograph, it could be a painting, it could be a sculpture, a drawing, a t-shirt, any number of things. But the idea that it depicts an animal kind of as understood through a human lens. And so that's sort of what I've been thinking about in these past few months, and I am excited to talk more about that today and what that could be, and kind of looking at some details of that definition. So I think one place that I started was with the project Zoo by Richard Billingham, and I felt like this really kind of straddles multiple points kind of into this world of visual anthrozoology, not only in the fact that it depicts animals themselves, but it shows them in a specific context, that being the zoo. I think that the work really has an element of ambiguity. It doesn't really seem to be for or against. And I think that this kind of gray area really starts to dive into some of the really interesting conversations that can happen within the world of visual anthrozoology. So, Giovanni, I know that you published some of Billingham's work in Antenna back in 2008. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like what this type of work or works like it can show us or teach us about our interactions with animals. Kind of what are your thoughts about both photography and zoos, and how they function as a human-made frame that we often kind of see animals through?
Sure, that's a big question. I'll try not to take out the whole length of the panel trying to answer it. Let's start from the project itself before we move to discussing the medium of photography and what it can do or what it has done. I think Richard Billingham is a very interesting choice. I was positively surprised, let's say, when you brought that project back. I had in part forgotten about it. I think it was a wonderful project in 2008, and I began to ask myself why it had sort of moved into the back burner in my thinking. And it's perhaps because, in a sense, it does seem dated now. Mm-hmm. And I have begun to wonder if that datedness originates from what you have noticed, that the work is not necessarily taking a clear political stance towards the situations animals endure in zoos and the ethical parameters that zoos still entail today. And your invitation prompted me to return to those images and think about them again, rediscover them in the light of today. over 10 years after they were made and disseminated. And I still think that they're very much of their time, in the sense that they remind me of a critical approach that was typical of animal studies at that time, at the time in which we were trying to understand human-animal relationships without imposing too much ethical constrictions, because the initial questions of animal studies were very radical, existentialist, and they were deconstructive in essence. The focus was on questioning Western philosophy and the exclusion of the animal from discourses, questioning the very singularity of the word animal and its constrictions. So let's say that it was a time of caution and excitement, or cautious excitement, in which we embraced the subject and wanted to negotiate alterity in very calibrated ways. What I found really fascinating about Richard Billingham's work is that Richard Billingham was not an animal studies photographer. He never, I think, identified himself as the kind of photographer that specializes in the representation of animals. In fact, as I'm sure many will remember, his breakthrough work was the documentation about his mother and father living in the council estate in which he grew up, that turned into the book Raise a Laugh. That was a massive hit. And in more than one interview, Richard Billingham explains how he never wanted to become a niche photographer, a genre photographer, and that he wanted to swap genres and lens of inquiry. But at the same time, I still feel that there's a connection between what he was doing just a few years prior with this project and what he ends up doing in the 2000s with Zoo. There are interesting concerns here about captivity. There are interesting concerns about the domestic sphere, and also objectification, the question of sentimentality. There is also a question of exploitation and the power of the gaze. What is public? What should be exposed? What is private? And I think the two, in a sense, the two projects sort of bounce off each other. They amplify each other when they are considered in juxtaposition. There's something of the exposing of the lives of animals in the series that I think avoids deliberately sentimentality, as well as the series representing his mother and father avoids sentimentality. And I think that, again, brings me back to that sensitivity of early animal studies. The role of sentimentality in our relationship with animals through representation, the fear of sentimentality that pervaded those early days, that was very palpable. So I remember, for instance, how Lanzier was seen as a not so interesting artist to focus upon at the time because of the romanticization of his animal representations. You know, he was the royal favorite pet portraitist who portrayed the dogs and pets of Queen Victoria with a kind of humanness and glint of humanness in their eyes. And I think Richard Billingham positions himself right there in that question of sentimentality that today has become a question of empathy. I think the whole discourse of animal studies has shifted from a nervousness about sentimentality to the other side, where sentimentality is not an obstacle to accessing the real animal, the animal beyond the representational, the being that is alive and over, and let's say that always eludes us in so many ways, the other. But it has become a question of proximity, a question of bridging. And I think that flickering between sentimentality and empathy is where interesting questions lie today. So in the context, shifting from zoos, I think we can talk about zoos more, right? So I don't want to preempt everything. But zoos are, in my opinion, pretty sad places, just generally speaking. Everyone will remember John Berger very clearly explaining how An animal that's in a zoo no longer is an animal because it's been extrapolated from its environment. So it no longer behaves like an animal. And at that point, what we see is a different kind of entity. That's the result of a human construction, that it's manifested by the architecture, by the constriction, by the removal. There are so many colonialist tropes that create these sort of hybridized creatures that no longer are truly animals. And I think photography, in a sense, adds to the question of the animal in problematic ways. While it's clear that photography offers an ethical opportunity to view animals without making animals suffer, photography has also very much fomented the myth of the sublime animal, that, as we know, has created a different kind of separation and distancing from the non-human world. Photography enables visibility, and at the same time, it perpetrates, or it can perpetrate, the distancing that the word itself, nature, represents in our thinking about animals. So there are strategies that different artists have deployed over time in order to challenge the ability of photography to objectify. I think it would be a mistake to assume that photography is the answer to zoos. And I guess the question that would be also interesting to me to explore today with Katherine and Mark is visibility and proximity. I feel like, as a child, I would be taken to the zoo, and there was something incredible about the proximity with a real living giraffe or an elephant. And as a child, you struggle to understand how their lives has been limited and how much they suffer in those conditions. And yet the photograph can never quite replicate the thrill. So there's a question of objectification, a question of entertainment, a question of proximity that photography cannot quite replace. Photography constructs something else somewhere else. I think as an economy of visibility. If I think about photography in the zoo as epistemologies of visibility, they are, in a sense, similar, and they're very different in their results. But the question to me becomes, how do we relate to animals? How can we engage? And I'm not saying that the zoo is a form of engagement with animals. The opposite, perhaps it's true. But how can we engage with animals if they are only and exclusively in our lives two-dimensional representations on a screen or in a photograph? And I know the answer is not the zoo. It's not to entrap them. But there's certainly a question of empathy that also can pertain to environments like the zoo.
I mean, I do think it is really interesting to that you bring up John Berger and that original essay, which is really, it's kind of like the match that lights the fuse that leads to animal studies in some way, and it's such an important text, and it's also really a text about. It's a text related to an exhibition of photography about animals in the zoo, right? So there is something really. I think kind of core to animal studies that text. I'm just curious if we just substituted the illustrations and the artist name in the Berger text with Billingham, would it read in the same way? And that to me is really interesting. But also I can't really see these images as neutral in a way that you're saying, Giovanni, because they do to me seem to be very sympathetic in their presentation of the abject conditions, right? So I don't see them as entirely neutral. And one of the things I would say about the animals in the zoo is that in a sense they are, of course, animals and they are individuals, but they are also representations in a sense that they become individuals that are representations because of the way that their frame is built around them, the way that they exist in this sort of context and their lack of agency in a sense. And that's always been sort of people's argument for zoos is to come into contact with the real thing, as though it's not somehow the real thing, the real being isn't somehow framed by this context of the enclosure, whatever that might mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Catherine, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, just mark that point you brought up about the Billingham photos not being very neutral is really what sparked something that we should dig into deeper when we see the New York Zoological Society guidebook photos, where they're presenting very idealized images of animals that are so different than these other photos. You know, like I feel like the value judgments in them become very clear when they're side by side or near each other in a way that's helpful for trying to sort that out. Or maybe, did you have one of Sultan the lion in there? Or
yes, I believe Sultan is in here. Yeah.
They were very proud of this lion.
Yeah.
Which is a very different way to depict a zoo surrounding.
Well, what I thought was so interesting is the kind of the way that an image like this is framed in 1905 as like a postcard, right? This is something that, like, to your point, that they're proud of and want to share with the world. But if we were to see an image like this now, it would have a vastly different reading, I would imagine. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, kind of a great segue in a way to some of the things that, you know, we were talking about zoos and talking about photography. And one of the things that I did just on a whim at some point is I Googled Bronx Zoo photography, and I just wanted to see what that would produce. And so what was so interesting, and I think Katherine, I sent this to you, was there was this page that came up that it didn't look like it was necessarily supposed to be public facing in a way. I wasn't quite sure, but it was really interesting to me because it gave a really an insight into how zoos themselves think about the use of representation, think about the use of photography, and so when we look at this, it's almost kind of like a guide of how to take pictures in a zoo, how to take pictures of animals in a zoo, which I think is, you know, at first I was like, oh my gosh, this is funny, you know, and at first I didn't even think it was real. I mean, but you know, all photos are treated using a slight warming filter, tasteful contrast, HDR photos are not appropriate. But these kinds of things that are this guide really it put a spotlight on the fact that zoos, and not to single out just the Bronx Zoo, but zoos in general, are and have been very aware of that kind of Venn diagram of the public and representation and photography and animals within the zoos. So, Katherine, I know that you have done a lot of research and know a ton about the history of zoos, specifically New York City zoos. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and kind of that kind of complicated Venn diagram.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this sort of defunct photo branding page is amazing for how it's really showing all the work that goes into creating the natural at the zoo. And it's not just in real time when people are there, but it's also in these images that get circulated later. And really the Bronx Zoo, I'm going to focus on the Bronx Zoo a lot because that's what I write about, and that's what I know the most.
Sure.
Originally, I came to this massive history project because I worked there as a sculptor making exhibits for a couple of years, and really showed me a lot about their sort of hyper naturalistic aesthetic that they're going for, that has everything to do today, at least, with that warm filter and a super positive vibe, very a little bit Disney-esque. But before that, so the Bronx Zoo's been really obsessive over photography since they opened in 1899. And that had everything to do with them wanting to control their reputation and their image around the world. They really wanted to be the biggest and the best zoo ever, they did succeed in being the largest zoo. They're 260 acres or something, which beats the next largest zoo is the DC Zoo. That was 140 acres, at least at the time in 1899. So they were immediately very large, but they needed to prove themselves as these like scientific professionals at a time when that was professional biology was still forming in the United States. It was sort of up for grabs. How that would go and how that would form, especially with live animals, this really hadn't happened on this scale yet in the United States. Philadelphia Zoo existed, Cincinnati Zoo existed, but they hadn't really tried to merge this super large collection with these professional aspirations. So photography was banned at the zoo for its first 40 years or something until one of their most influential founders, Madison Grant, died in 1937. And instead of having visitors take photographs, they produced all of these postcards. We saw that when I was Sultan, and they produced illustrated guidebooks, which was typical of zoos. So Philadelphia Zoo had one, I believe Cincinnati Zoo had guidebooks as well. Some differences were that a lot of the other zoos used engravings instead of photographs. And the Bronx Zoo was pretty much all photographs. They might have included a few engravings, but yeah, I'm not sure what year this one's from. So what they were really wanting to do was, if you look at all these photographs, the animals are alone and they're photographing their best individual. And they really wanted to project this idea that they have a ton of species. They were, to be a scientific zoo, they had to fill out the taxonomy. They needed a lot of individual animals, but also the most representative of all the taxa in the world. So they're picking out these idealized creatures to serve as their posters for their collection, these emblems of the perfect animal, which is really different than what we might think of in that that branding page that you showed us that had more different species together, and it showed plants. And, so ecology, the onset of ecology and changes to animal husbandry and what was possible in that really shifted clearly what these ideal photographs would be. The goal shifted from being about showing this large array of taxa, kind of like gotta catch them all, and to these sort of embedded experiential things that really could sort of place humans in a different relationship to the animals at the zoo. So, I mean, there's so many ways that this question could go. Oh, this one's great. So the Bronx Zoo was the first zoo in the United States to have pandas. And it's a fascinating story. And this must have been in the 1940s, I think, maybe the 50s.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So anyway, for 40 years, they didn't let anybody photograph there unless it was somebody special. People would write special requests. If it was a big donor, they were allowed to photograph there. Another thing the Bronx Zoo was very invested in from the beginning was supporting visual artists who weren't photographers. They really felt that the United States needed to build up their animal artistry. And so the Lion House had a special salon where sculptors and painters and illustrators could get closer to the lions, and they had all these special stations set up for visual artists, as long as they weren't photographers, to create like a new genre in the United States that they hoped would sort of bolster this national sentiment towards wildlife that would hopefully lead to more conservation of it in certain cases. They weren't sort of like unilaterally trying to save all animals. They were very into hoofed animals for the most part, and birds. They did a lot for migratory birds. So in that, I would also say that the photography that the Bronx Zoo did produce, they used it a lot in newspaper articles. They were really trying to teach people how to use the zoo. Zoos were relatively new in the United States, and from the letters that I've read that came in from people in like the early 1900s, like 1900 to 1910 or so, people are writing in with questions about the well-being of animals or what they should do at the zoo, how they should go around to the different exhibits, and the zoo would put out occasional newspaper articles about what you could learn there, the different evolutionary theories you could learn at the zoo, or how to have a good time by visiting all the right exhibits in the right order. So they were using these images to tell people like what to absorb from their exhibits, and at the same time they were also trying to calm people down and make them comfortable with something that a lot of people called out, but they were like, you're keeping all these animals captive and some of them look very sick, and the director of the zoo would have these really great postcards where these animals were very healthy looking and they were not molting. He really didn't want any photographs circulating of animals molting because he didn't want that interpreted as mange or some other kind of ill health. But so people in New York, it was mainly New Yorkers who visited the zoo frequently. They were often a little uncomfortable with the new situation that had moved into their neighborhood, and I think some of these images that show these idealized animals serve to sort of calm people's fears about this being like maybe not the most ethical situation. And then another thing that these images did, which is a little harder to tease out, and I'm working on this project now, is that the president of the New York Zoological Society, which is like the parent organization of the Bronx Zoo, which is now called the Wildlife Conservation Society. The president, Henry Fairfield Osborn, was also the president of the American Museum of Natural History. And he wrote some really interesting sort of like essays, occasionally a book, about the power of nature visualizations to affect the moral capacities of individuals. And he really felt that like a well-composed tableau, whether it's in a flat image, in a diorama at the museum, or in a living tableau at the zoo, had the ability to sort of like awaken the greatest potential within individuals. And he was this was like, when he wrote words like that, he absolutely meant it in some kind of racial hierarchy. He was very into eugenics. He felt like the nature tableaus he was creating were moralizing in a way that could sort of like resonate on an evolutionary level. And therefore he extended that to sort of like, he was doing work to improve the country by providing the right nature scenes. He took it was a very deep cause for him, and it's interesting how it weaves through all these different avenues of thought, that aren't necessarily connected on the surface. Like it's entertainment and it's moral uplift, but he's also trying to really like strengthen the stock of America through these moralizing pictures. Or this, yeah, there's the United States. And they weren't above entertainment, they often like to think they were, but they definitely dressed a bunch of chimpanzees and orangutans in human clothing and made them have tea together regularly.
Yeah, I remember seeing a number of those postcards that were just kind of variations on that theme.
Yeah, and so, they did have these very tight reins on photography in the beginning, and they had very overt moralistic goals. And I think the tenor of the zoo has changed today. They don't have, Madison Grant and Henry Osborn aren't around to have these like moralizing imperatives for the institution, but there's something else going on. And I think a lot of the modern photographs, like going back to that website, are really aimed at making people feel a part of something positive. They're a key part of constructing this narrative of care that the zoo constantly is bolstering. That's their like reason for being is care of animals, especially the Bronx Zoo and the Wildlife Conservation Society. So these images, these image guidelines that were created are really more, they're not as overtly moralistic, but they are absolutely telling a story, and they're telling you how to see the zoo in the same way.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. I keep thinking about images like these, and you mentioned like the certain species of animals that would appear over and over again, whether it's the charismatic megafauna or hooved animals or things like that. And when I was looking at these postcards here, and then Giovanni, when you had mentioned Colleen Plum's work, and her more recent work that were primarily looking at elephants and her kind of projected videos, I wanted to maybe even circle back to that a little bit and see how you see images like this relating to that, even though they're separated by 100 years or so. I wonder if you could touch upon that at all.
Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting comparison, also in the sense that I think Billingham's images are cautious in the sense that Billingham is not passing judgment upon zoos as places that should be shut down. I think it's important to remember, and I think Catherine's overview of some of the imagery that circulated earlier on in the history of zoos in America shows how photography can manipulate our perception of an institution and how animals are treated within it. And we have to remember as well animal rights photography that calls out in very aggressive and graphic ways the suffering of animals in zoos. And I think Billingham's images certainly don't fall into that category. That's why I think they are in somewhere in the middle between an acknowledgement that these spaces are sad. I see them as tinged with melancholia, but I don't see them as a call for shutting zoos down. And I think that deliberate staying on the fence is generated by this idea that the zoo represents our colonialist heritage in so many ways. So shutting it down is not necessarily to Billingham, I think, the ultimate aim, like it would be in the case of an animal rights activist artist like Colleen Plum could be considered. I think Billingham is much more interested in understanding what led us to the zoo as a solution, what keeps us hanging on to it. And to him, the biggest question is really our colonialist framework. So I think Colleen Plum actually presents us with a much more geared and activist approach to photography. I feel like she uses photography and film in order to denounce the suffering of these animals in a very clear way, where Billingham's suggests loneliness, emptiness, and silence, and the meaningless of a life that it's spent within constrictions and in isolation. Colleen Plum has decided to focus on the repetitive behavior that we see in captive animals in zoos, which is called stereotypical behavior. And stereotypic behavior occurs as a result of the actual constriction. So the title of our project that we're seeing here, 30 times a minute, there is something really interesting about the very notion of connecting the heartbeat and connecting the repetition of the swinging of a trunk or pacing back and forth. And this pacing back and forth is the result of the constriction of the animal behavior, where elephants are able in the wild to walk 50 miles per day, and then they find themselves constricted in cages or enclosures that don't allow them that. So this extraction from their environment produces a twitch, a compulsive behavior that ultimately also ends up wearing down their bodies. And I think there is something really sad about it, because that's the visible and tangible sign of unhappiness that many zookeepers, as Colleen Plum has said, have denied. She's visited over 70 zoos for her project, And she's spoken to many zookeepers to try and understand, to get a sense of what this behavior might be caused by. And apparently only one acknowledged that it's the way they cope with captivity. And it is heartbreaking. I think it's important that the title of our work harkens back to the heart of the elephant. And again, going back to the point I was making at the very beginning, this fear or suspicion of animal studies at the very beginning with the notion of sentimentality that has now shifted to a desire for empathy is very much represented, I think, by this kind of approach where our video work is a tool to make visible something that the zoo would like you to not see, not notice, or misinterpret. I remember in an interview, she mentioned how overhearing visitors imagining that the repetitive movement is a dance, as if the animal were happy, which is clearly not the case. So what I appreciate about her work is how she's trying to correct that misconception and expose that suffering in a way that we can't quite escape, especially when she projects it over buildings and causes us to stop in our tracks. There's something really interesting here about this connection between the visitor at the zoo that has entered the zoo expecting a certain experience and therefore seeing mostly what the zoo want them to see, which harkens back to what Katherine is saying. The manipulation of the images ultimately is also the manipulation of our minds and how the zoo wants us to digest the experience. The images are probably a byproduct or a guidance for that experience. But I think by taking out of context these images and presenting them in the urban context, Colleen really asks us to stop in our tracks and consider what we're encountering away from that context, but still in the context of the impossibility of really combining certain nature-culture divides that are still faulty, that are still part of a fraught foundation.
I think it's interesting to think about the fact that perhaps some of the species that are least suited to captivity, like an African elephant, are often some of the most imaged, the most photographed, the most, disseminated out into the world. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, the fact that perhaps those that are least appropriate to be kept in captivity are the ones that we see the most in captivity.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and are the most charismatic and also very susceptible to stereotypical behavior, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
The large bears, the tigers, animals that have very large territories and also are very large-bodied themselves and charismatic.
On Andy's point about what gets photographed, a zoo, just as in 1899, they still want the same large animals. Even though they say that they've changed to be conservation centers, I think most of them are driven to still have the megafauna. Monterey Bay Aquarium, slightly different. They don't keep as many in captivity, but point people to where to see them in the wild. But I think most zoos are still dedicated to this idea of you're the best zoo if you have the most representative taxa, which is what Giovanni was talking about, these colonial roots and imperial roots, the world in miniature, things like that.
Yeah.
And I had another thought while everyone was talking, just it's hard to figure out where to place this when we're talking about art photography or this kind of photography that circulates in this way. But another thing zoos do is they prohibit photography behind the scenes today. And that's doing a lot of work, or they don't prohibit it, but employees, all the elephant keepers who wouldn't talk about the consequences or the reasons for these stereotype behaviors, they've probably signed non-disclosure agreements and could lose their job for talking about it, and I think that this is a very strong control over imagery and this PR that sort of is threaded through our whole talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to maybe shift gears slightly.
Before we do, I just
Please.
want to mention something. I mean, in relationship to what the images Catherine was showing us, and I think what's really interesting about them is they are this sort of almost this middle point between what we think about as natural history illustration. You know, these taxonomic engravings that we see from I mean, all the way back to Conrad Gessner and through Buffon and through, these textbooks in the 19th and early 20th century, but they're just substituting that taxonomic image with a photograph. So this is before really wildlife in situ photography, right? And I think that this is a really fascinating period because it is that middle point where the kind of glorious wildlife photography that we're used to in the National Geographic tradition isn't quite there yet. And this kind of has that, in the same way it has one foot in spectacle and one foot in science, very much like the zoo does. And I think Catherine's totally right in terms of seeing the people who were running the zoo really saw this as an incredible act of public influence, right? That they were entirely bound into the conservation sensibility, and that the zoo was one of the most important places where that message was being sent. And they were conservation activists and conservation radicals, and very, very conscious of that. They wrote books on this topic, and so the zoo was just one of many tools that they used to promote their conservation agenda.
Can I just, I can't move on without just a little asterisk on what their conservation radicalism was, because they were quite radical, but it's just not what a lot of people would have think conservation is today. So this fallow deer is perfect because they really modeled the Bronx Zoo to be a mix of game preserves in the US West and European zoos, older European zoos like the London Zoo and Berlin Zoo. But they were very focused not on habitat, so to speak, even though they were responsible for creating a bunch of national parks, because eventually they connected these things, but they were very interested in certain species. And very against other species, most predators for at least the early part of the 1900s. So they were really against wolves or sharp-shinned hawks, and things that they saw as sort of wanton killers. And it's just a very different vision. And then there's some like Crimes Against Nature by Carl Jacobi has a great telling of how their vision of conservation was very elitist, and that's worth just.
And very much about protecting their privilege to be able to hunt these animals, and that because of course they see nature as this kind of thing that man tests their manlyhoodness against through activities like hunting. And so if you get rid of all these animals, the next generation is not going to be able to obtain those kind of macho values of expressing their domination over nature and being challenged by nature. Yeah, I totally agree.
So a risk overall, it's masculinity itself, right?
Right.
Mark, I wonder too if I like your analogy about natural history illustration and the photographs that Catherine has shared. And I was also wondering about the kind of dioramic aesthetic here, in the sense that also the conservation approach of dioramas, I'm thinking about Chapman, Pelican Island, that conservation thread has always been there. And it almost feels like in both cases, like whether it's natural history, whether it's dioramas or zoos, the killing or the suffering of the animal ultimately must be denied through some kind of illusory aesthetic device. And in the case of the images Catherine has shown, it seems like removing the boundaries of the zoo sometimes, not always, but sometimes is one of the strategies. It's a kind of like rewilding, right? Metaphorical rewilding of the captive animal. That's why I think also the picture of the lion surrounded by the brick wall stands out so much as unusual. It's not really following that aesthetic philosophy of rewilding. It's almost just acknowledging that these animals end up living in situations that are wholly artificial.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, that's true. Of course, we're talking about really the same set of people, the people who were at the zoo and the people who are at the American Museum of Natural History, all are very much know each other. They're all very much involved in the same discourse. They've trained and studied at the same places. They're part of the same gentlemen's clubs and things like that. So that conversation certainly exists across those two institutions. And I think that there is, on one hand, there's this advocacy element to dioramas as much as to the zoo, like you're talking about Frank Chapman, but there's also this kind of melancholic sense that these are going to be the only way one could experience wild Africa, because wild Africa was going to disappear in their mind, was these this Akeley Hall African Hall, and that in some way there would be no, it was before large scale preserves, before parks, before any of that existed in Africa. So there is this kind of notion that this will be the shrine for the African lost nature. Something incredibly perverse about this.
And also tied to that is the idea they had no problem saying we can kill them and you can't, like they did feel that they were the chosen community who had the level of reason, this like upper class white community who were the conservation stewards. And so therefore they knew how to kill ethically, but market hunters, people who needed to hunt to live or, for any other reason, did not know how to have an ethical relationship with nature. And, some of this is slightly off topic, but some of the most fascinating writing comes when they've decided to build the Bronx Zoo. And it's just a park. It's 261 acres of woodland. And there's all these discussions with the local community about what's going to happen. And the zoo starts policing. They start telling people they can't cut that timber. They kick out a few people who lived in this park, and it's just like this really interesting negotiation with a group of people who are already using nature in a very interesting way. And the zoo comes in and they're like, no, we're going to teach you how to like actually use it. But so, yeah, I mean, there's they had no sense of hypocrisy in this, what they considered scientific killing.
So I think that we can shift gears slightly, and I wanted to, just keeping eye on time and everything. I want to see if Mark, if you could talk a bit about your work. And we talked a little bit beforehand, and I think about the Library for the Birds series of installations. I think about, so much of your work, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you've utilized representations of animals in your work, and then especially kind of if there's a difference in function or approach when you're working with something like a drawing of an animal versus a taxidermied animal versus a living animal, and how your approach varies from one to the next.
Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, I am, of course, extremely engaged in the discussion about animals and about which I really came through being interested in the sort of crisis of biodiversity and things that I was becoming aware of in the sort of late 80s, right? And so I started to focus a lot on animals and biodiversity and conservation strategies, and that kind of brought me to look at the history of the representation of animals, and brought me back to looking at these institutions that sort of imagine themselves as constructing what animals mean and what animals are. So natural history museums, zoos, wildlife parks, these kinds of places. And, and I've done a really wide variety of works on this topic, including several aviaries. And that really began, I guess, in the early 90s, like 93, working in Antwerp, a city that still had an extremely active bird market, and people who kept birds was very common, and there was a very large part of the society who kept and traded and lived with birds. And so And it was very easy to follow that back to the early colonial roots, when things are coming from Africa, Asia, and the New Worlds, arriving in a major port city like Antwerp, and also being disseminated through that point, because Antwerp was itself a site of intellectual investigation, but also a site of bookmaking. So books were being printed and then distributed, showing these new creatures, both alive and dead, and of course, there's a very particular relationship between Belgium and Africa that's very much embodied by the kinds of birds that were exhibited. But so I often had birds in contexts in which they were surrounded by representations of birds. And but most importantly was the interaction that visitors have in entering one of these spaces and having interactions with birds themselves. And so for me, that became increasingly the most important part of what these projects were, that the longer you stay in a space like this, and visitors certainly spend more time in a space like this than any other kind of exhibition I've ever done in terms of their level of engagement. And the more you spend it, of course, the more you get out of it, because you very quickly begin to understand that these birds are individuals, and that they exhibit very different kinds of behavior one from another. And the more time you spend, the more you are integrated into the experience of these birds, and the birds acknowledge you and your behavior as well. These are birds that have been usually bred in captivity, in countless generations, right? I mean, it would be very hard to know exactly when the last time one of these birds was in a wild context, but in some cases we're talking like maybe 50, maybe 100 generations. So they're very comfortable in this kind of context, except that perhaps their situation is probably better than they will ever have for the rest of their lives. This is kind of like the birds are in a spa condition for a very short period of time. They'll never have this much space to fly, to move, they'll never have this kind of availability of food, water, air, nesting opportunities that they'll have while they're in this, for this short period of time in this exhibition. Needless to say, it's tricky territory. And whenever you're working with live animals, it's tricky territory for a tremendous number of reasons, one of which being that they will never do what you expect them to do. And other that people, of course, this is a kind of abomination, right? What could be worse than seeing animals in captivity, and to see animals, perhaps even worse than seeing animals in a zoo, is to see animals in a museum, a place where they really are out of context.
And were you able to kind of ascertain what the types of reactions were as people were going into these aviaries and seeing these birds and interacting with them in the way? Were you able to get an idea of how that might have affected people that interacted with it?
Well, I think, there are contexts where where people have not been allowed in the cage, and it's a dramatically different piece, and it's the entire fulcrum of the work is that you have an interaction with a living being who acknowledges you, who's going on about their day, and that the more you observe them, the more you can understand that there's a tremendous amount of complexity and thought going on, right? And so if you can't go in the cage, it's a very, very different piece. So I think I can very easily see a difference between your experience being able to enter the cage, which is the entire point of the piece, and not being able to enter the cage. Generally, the piece is, is the response is usually some kind of delight in a way, some kind of, I think it motivates curiosity. I think people find, unlike a lot of my work, which is very focused on perhaps melancholic reaction, I think that this is a piece that perhaps doesn't come immediately.
And so I wonder how you compare these installations with something like Life of a Dead Tree, that, talking about the melancholy and how those two exhibits compare with one another, both in terms of how you made them and then also the way in which visitors interact with them.
Well, I think Life of a Dead Tree is a project in which I've taken a tree that had recently died because of the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that's accidentally been introduced into North America. And it's something that people often have a kind of quite abstract idea about what this is, if they have any idea at all. So I did this in Toronto, and when I went to Toronto the first time, walking through the city, there was just a constant chorus of chainsaws. And the city was in the process of removing all of the trees that were infected, which were pretty much all of the ash trees, and many of the trees in Toronto were ash trees. And no one kind of understood what was happening. And so a project like this definitely has a relationship to, I think, scientific pedagogy in a sense. So I worked with a team of entomologists and with the Natural History Museum, and we brought this tree in with the hope that it was infested with the emerald ash borer. And there was really no way to 100% guarantee that. So this could have been a quite disastrous project in a sense. And then throughout the course of the exhibition, and the exhibition was long enough that we could find all of the different life stages of the emerald ash borer, and use this as a kind of opportunity where people would, I mean, this is not the kind of thing you normally see when you come into a museum, right? So you take the elevator up and suddenly you are in this space that is, it's of course it's like a gallery, but it's also like perhaps a morgue, and perhaps a natural history museum, and perhaps a botanical garden. Of course, the tree itself has a lot of presence. It's not alive, but it has a lot of life still on it. And it has moisture and all of that. So the quality of air, the atmosphere is very different when you enter this space. And then I am there often with the entomologist, and we are working on trying to uncover the emerald ash borer within this piece in all of its various life cycles. So starting, when we first got the tree, we were finding lots of grubs, these sort of worm-like form of the ash borer, which is the one that eats the tissue between the bark and the hardwood of the tree, which is why it kills the tree. And then later on, we were able to find those that were turned into the pupa, this intermediate stage. And then finally, the tree exploded with mature emerald ash borers. So needless to say, this is not a museum that has a collection. This is really like the registrar's nightmare. Every registrar's nightmare is this project. And so the exhibition was never the same any 2 days. So every day you would visit it, it would be a very different kind of experience for you. You would have, there would be different activities going on. There would be different stages in the life cycle. There would be photography that was constantly added of all of the organisms that we were finding, and essentially making a sort of scientific collection from this tree itself. So there is, like the aviary pieces, it has a living dimension, and it has a performative dimension, and it's something that one doesn't merely stand back and observe, right? That there's an interactive element to it. In this case, there are also the entomologists and I who can be interrogated about science or art.
Yeah, it speaks to that proximity and engagement that Giovanni was talking about, that can happen in a zoo environment, but in a much different way.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, for me, it was an important way to make this thing that was happening, this kind of phenomena that was happening, very concrete to people, right? That they could, in a way, it's no longer mysterious why people are taking these trees down all around the city, and those people are not in some are not a part of an evil cabal trying to destroy the urban forest, but are quite the opposite, really trying to figure out a way to save what's left of the urban forest.
Right, right. That's
You know,
yeah. Go on, Catherine.
just I love this project for how it plays with these questions of rarity and access that we've been talking about throughout this hour. And also what Giovanni brought up in the beginning of sentimentality and empathy. You know, I feel like you, with this project, Mark, you're giving this huge amount of access to, in a way, and with the bird project, you know, in a way that is not present in all these other forms that we're talking about. And it changes how people are able to either have, you know, reflect on sentimentality or empathy or all of these things. And the rarity in the tree project is operating differently. Like in the zoo, the rarity and the draw are these charismatic animals that are hard to get from different lands. But here it's almost information, you know, it's like this very localized information that people just, there's no channel for people to learn about why the trees are getting cut down. And you create.
Yeah, exactly. And if people do learn, it is very abstract, and it's very it feels like some kind of weird alien invasion when you actually hold an emerald ash borer in your hands. You know, it's a very different kind of thing. You see how this organism, which is actually quite charismatic. I mean, they are very beautiful, but they're very, very small. And but how this thing can, because we're playing ecological Russian roulette by moving things across the world all the time. You know, it makes that very concrete.
Mark, I also I'm thinking about the Library for Birds and how you foregrounded the importance of spending time in the space, observing the birds and realizing that they have identities, personalities, behaviors that are different, I think, from what we are allowed to experience in the context of the zoo by the architectural structure of the zoo itself. It's not, to me, it's impossible to forget that the zoo, the Natural History Museum, let's say the modern zoo, because of course we're not talking about the history of menageries and, you know, the long lineage of these spaces in which animals have been made captive. But the modern genealogy brings us back to the department store and the navigation of these spaces as shop windows or vitrines. And I feel that that is what alienates us also in the possibilities of engagement with these animals. Of course, the architecture prevents us from staying around too long. It's just a display. There is so much to see. Animals are calling for attention involuntarily in the context of the zoo. And so they do in the Natural History Museum with the dioramas. Yeah. It's hard to focus because there's so many incredible things to see. And yet we find ourselves glancing and moving on very swiftly, never able to see beyond the surface. And I think that's what's fascinating about your project, you know, inviting people to slow down, inviting people to spend time with those animals. It's probably, I think, as close as a gallery environment can become to a domestic sphere. So like our engagement with pets, which is very different from our engagement with the captive animals in the zoo.
And for me, I mean, and one of the, you know, of course, the absurdist trope in this is that we've made a library for birds, and birds seem to be very interested in a lot of things, but they're not really interested in the library, right? And that's kind of trying to emphasize that we are going to project on them, and they are not here, you know, for us, and they're not here for our projections, even if these are captive birds that have been bred for generations to fulfill our fantasy and of what is beautiful and what is remarkable. That's really not their reason for being.
Yeah.
This is Fairfield. He's just been remarkably quick in his consumption of ice cream sandwich.
Yeah, that ice cream sandwich looks great.
Okay, baby. Let me work, okay? Thank you.
So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about this idea of engagement and engagement with kind of the public at large, and how we tend to see representations of animals and of nature being used in that regard. And I think the next kind of two questions can kind of go together with one, in the sense that, we see images of animals in news stories when there's some kind of novel interaction between a human and an animal, and so many times it's tragic, whether it be, we talked about invasive species, whether it be invasive pythons in the Everglades, or various captive tragedies that happen with captive pets. And we see it through news outlets, but also through documentaries like Tiger King and things like that, they all very, very carefully utilize representations of animals, and they're engaging millions and millions and millions of people. And so I'm wondering, kind of to the whole panel, what your thoughts are on how images of animals and of nature are being used kind of within that journalistic or documentary sphere at the moment.
Shall I get the ball rolling?
Sure.
Okay. This is a very interesting question from a number of perspectives, because I feel, again, returning to the early days of animal studies, the question of representation was central. It was important to avoid objectification, but also to avoid the sublime animal. The sublime animal being partly what we have seen in Catherine's images, the idea of an animal that becomes a symbol for human concerns, and that as such stops being a living creature, but it becomes an icon that belongs to the aesthetic realm. It's objectified, it's flattened to a two-dimensional realm. And Tiger King, for instance, is a great example of the glamorization of the sublime animal again. The sublime animal, as Mark very well knows, Mark laid the foundations of this idea of charismatic megafauna. Was it the 80s, Mark? Was it 86, 89?
89 maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important question, which animals we favor and why, and how we want to see them, how we can conceive animals for our purposes, for our cultural contexts. And I think, unfortunately, I see a misalignment between the conversations we are having in academia and what's happening on newsreels, as well as wildlife documentaries. I think there's still a big discrepancy with how the most important wildlife documentaries are being filmed. The sublime, it's still the lens through which we see nature, despite the fact that artists like Mark and many other scholars and artists have done enormous work to deconstruct that vision and to build alternative visions. And still, I don't see it sticking with the mainstream. I'm thinking about the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, for instance, where the winner, most often, I have to say, one year they threw me with the two mice fighting, punching each other on the London Underground platform. I thought, okay, that's cute and quirky. That's an odd one. But otherwise, it was all very sexy, sublime animals that have been described in the context of animal studies as the pornography of nature. So to me, that's problematic, because I know we're doing a lot of useful work. I see it in the changes that are around us in museums. I see it in changes in the publishing world. Students are much more interested today in these subjects than they were 20 years ago. But it feels like two parallel worlds. And I'd be really interested to hear what Katherine and Mark think about this, whether you have a less bleak vision of this separation.
I don't have a less bleak vision at all. I mean, I agree with you that animals are so entertaining. that I don't think most people are going to give up how, at least right now, like these images we're seeing are a result of how exciting they are, and they're part of our world. They're like a part of our fabric, so they're going to be around. And I don't think that the hard thing to do is to go for empathy or to try and not objectify. That's so much harder than watching Tiger King. And it's it also sort of resonates with how unpopular it is, let's say, to be anti-zoo, even in maybe like a liberal crowd or something. There's still many people still think that they are these good organizations and good for animals. So it's I don't know when these other representations of animals that we've talked about today, I don't know if or when they would win people over or gain this mainstream thing without appealing to some of these other aspects that these things are doing. Like I feel like watching Planet Earth or Tiger King or any of these things, or reading that article about the chimpanzee attacks, like there is a searching in it. Like people are searching for something because it's thrilling or it's comforting or it's inspiring, and those emotions are so much more accessible than what's underneath. And so that, I think, is some of the problem and why this is happening. I think it's okay. I think it's great for animals to be in the media, if in a lot of situations, but these objectifying situations are like they're winning over now.
Yeah, and I think that mechanism has been there for a long time, right? It's the animal as spectacle. And we see this like in the very beginnings of photography. It's the first of this animal found. And that's still, of course, a story whenever a new species is described. That's one of the ways animals can get some ink, is to be found to Western science. But that notion of the first, or this is the deepest the camera has ever gone, and this is the first time this ritual dance has ever been filmed, and all of these kinds of things that really have been haunting us since the very beginning of animal representations. The first rhinoceros in Europe. We're still kind of stuck with these narratives, and it's not about discovery.
That also becomes the big question with engagement. And I agree also with Katherine that, in a sense, the natural world has to look interesting. And I think about the economies of the time that we live in. I think about the emergency of climate change, and I think about the span of attention that apparently it's diminishing due to social media, and how can we grab people's attention, especially when they're not already inclined to give more than a certain amount of time. I think also, Mark, your point about animal as entertainment, it's the root of it all. It's part of that very objectifying notion that we have nurtured through colonialism. It's part of the spectacle. And I think what many artists and scholars have done over the past 30 years and a little more is to try and break that down so we can see through it. And the question is how to do it in an effective way that remains engaging. And that's, I think, also what you've accomplished in your work with the cabinets of curiosities in museums. There's a balance that can be accomplished in order to retain a certain level of accessibility and a certain level of engagement through curiosity, but that doesn't necessarily have to speak the sublime language that separates us from the rest. And that seems to still be our challenge over 20 years down the line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That I often wonder and think about that engagement gap, and is there a way to start to bridge it? Is there a place, or are the more kind of critical spheres always going to be on a different place than the mainstream media, or can, or even should the two come closer to one another, and how could that be accomplished? Of course, I certainly don't have an answer, but I think it's something that is even in more stark relief now maybe than 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Andy, I have, well, at times I have little faith in what universities can accomplish, since they've been commoditized so much that I think they've lost a lot of their agency. But I like to believe that there is a possibility, especially when I see conversations that used to take place in academia 40 or 50 years ago. I'm thinking about feminism, race, more specifically. Those conversations started in academia. They started in universities, and they started elsewhere as well. I don't want to say that they were exclusive to universities, but universities really gave it the backbone and circulation through books and publications. And I feel that universities still have that gravitas today. I don't know that museums would be so inclined to exhibit Anthropocene and climate change based work if it hadn't been for the authors that have put that on the map on the scholarly field over the past 20 years. And I'd like to believe that at some point this also will bubble up. The question of the animal, the question of anthropomorphism, the question of the sublime. But my fear is that here the culprit is art history, and art more specifically in its tradition of wanting to trivialize the animal. That's based in the hierarchy of genres. So I'm thinking about that tradition that is absolutely patriarchal and anthropocentric, the notion that history, mythology, and religious paintings occupy the top ranks, and we should really be concerned with those. And then come portraits, and then comes landscape, and then at the very bottom you find animals and flowers and plants. And you can see how that hierarchy mirrors still today our uneasy relationship with the representation of animals and plants as gendered, as sentimental. But at the same time, what I've noticed is that museums have almost kind of bypassed the question of the animal on a certain scale, and they have rushed to the Anthropocene, because again, the Anthropocene can bring everything back to us so much more easily than animals and plants. That's my diagnosis of the issue that we're facing with this aesthetic resistance, aesthetic impossibility to overcome a problem, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that that's really expressed by how few exhibitions on these topics, I would say the Anthropocene as well as animals, have been undertaken by major museums, right? I mean, there's a huge hole in terms of how important these things are to culture, how important these things are to our very own survival, and how poorly represented they've been in major art institutions across the country. Your exhibition excluded, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that kind of comes back to one of the reasons that I wanted to have this panel today and have the three of you here and talk is to try and shine a light, albeit maybe a small light, on some of these topics. And besides just selfishly being just wanting to be in the same virtual room as the three of you and listen to you discuss these topics, which I find so fascinating, I think I'm hopeful that students will be able to engage with this material, and who knows where they might take it or where it might go. And so in a very, very, very small way, that's one of my hopes for something like this, is to make these conversations even slightly more visible.
Can I say something about bridging that gap?
Yeah, please.
It just got me thinking about different spheres that this bridge could come from, and something that I think gets to the same excitement level, or if not more, than Tiger King or Planet Earth, is something like the fight for non-human personhood. That offers like a really interesting, currently fantasy world, it really grabs people's attention, at least some people. And I think that kind of a like the Non-Human Rights Project is doing something with elephants now. Well, Happy, the elephant at the Bronx Zoo, they're going to court, I think this year, to argue the case for Happy's personhood. But I sort of like, when I hear what the Non-Human Rights Project is working on, I get a glimmer of hope that that does engage a large audience often. It's still, not off the ground, but I think that it is one avenue that can work in a lot of different ways to grab people's attention and give a very different perspective on animals.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's always, I guess, the challenge, right? Is to find that thing that can grab people and grab their attention, which is so fleeting. So I think that this might be a great way to wrap this up. But I wanted to obviously sincerely thank the three of you. It's been my absolute pleasure to have the three of you here and discuss some of these topics. And yeah, so I think I hopefully this was enjoyable for the three of you and worth an hour and a half of your Friday afternoon. But so thank you really so much for being here and discussing all of this.
Great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us together.